Imagine you are an ambitious father or a duke who has seized power in Rome, a city that urgently needs to become the capital of the world. Your signature is law, tax, and the life of any citizen. Bankers lend you gold, the guard ensures peace, and the cardinals are ready to sanctify any crime you commit. But unpleasant reports are placed before you. Advanced architecture and medicine are in the hands of Arabs and Persians, and you have neither the technology to surpass them nor ancient lineage to justify your power. Without grand symbols and a great past, you are merely a parvenu with an army, and your empire is secondary. With one gesture, the Colosseum transforms into a free quarry. Ancient marble is burned for lime. Persian blueprints are claimed as the insights of your artisans, and pocket antiquaries stamp fake tablets about your ancient ancestry. What will you choose? To accumulate knowledge from scratch for decades, acknowledging the superiority of the East, or to ransack the ruins, steal foreign technology, and sell this raid to future generations as a sudden revival of the human spirit? Now let's see how it looked in real history. We are told that the Renaissance is the moment when Europe suddenly awoke. Jewelers became architects. Apothecaries became anatomists. Poets unearthed forgotten classics and returned humanity its lost soul. A beautiful story, inspiring, and almost entirely built on silences. Here are 3 questions that official history prefers to sidestep. Why did the largest brick dome in the world appear without a single prototype, immediately in its final exemplary form? Why did the anatomical atlas that revolutionized medicine come out 5 years after Galen's textbook filled with errors from a man who had previously edited Arabic translations? And why, of the 180,000 Latin inscriptions that formed the history of Rome, did hundreds turn out to be made by one person in the 16th century? These are not marginal versions. These are documented facts with names, dates, and archival references. They simply create a different picture. None of these observations proves a conspiracy. They demonstrate something else. Behind the beautiful narrative of human genius lies a very concrete and pragmatic operation. An operation to appropriate someone else's material, someone else's technologies, and someone else's knowledge, followed by the establishment of ownership rights through biographers, forgers, and conveniently curated sources. Not birth, capture. Organized, methodical, and very profitable. Let's start with the most literal. Rome of the 15th century is not a city inspired by antiquity. It is an active quarry. If you want to understand how the Renaissance was built in a literal, physical sense, look not at the geniuses with brushes, but at the contractors with wheelbarrows and papal licenses in their pockets. Take the Colosseum. In less than a year, a single contractor removed 2,500 carts of stone from it. Not rubble, not gravel, carved blocks ready for use. These blocks were used in the foundations, walls, and cladding of new palaces. No quarrying in Carrara, no extraction, no production. Why spend money on marble extraction when there's a ready stockpile of millennia-old masonry nearby? Calculate. 2,500 carts. The average load is 1.5 tons. That's nearly 4,000 tons of processed stone. One contractor, 1 year, one monument. There are dozens of such contracts in the archives of Opera Romana from the 15th century. It was not a tradition, it was an industry. with licenses, contractors, and volumes that today would be called industrial dismantling. It simply appeared as spiritual continuity in the rhetoric of the time. Stone was transferred from a ruin to a new palace. The name of the pope or cardinal was inscribed on the new palace, and both, the building and the name, entered history as symbols of a revived civilization. Historians refer to this as spolia, the use of fragments from old structures in new buildings. Officially, it is presented as a sign of continuity, a respect for the past. At first glance, it sounds noble, but there is one nuance. The use of spoils reduced construction costs by about 80%. This is not a disrespect for the past. This is economics. Look at the Palazzo della Cancelleria, one of the most famous palaces of its time. 44 granite columns inside, all extracted from the baths of Damascus, which were dismantled specifically for this project. Not cast, not carved, just rearranged. And this building was later discussed as a masterpiece of architectural genius. A masterpiece of what exactly? Assembly design? Bramante built the Tempietto, one of the standard examples of the High Renaissance, a structure cited in every architecture textbook. The columns of the Tempietto are spolia, every single one of them. Borgia held the Latin title Restitutor Antiquitatis, restorer of antiquity. Meanwhile, his men methodically dismantled the forums and loaded stones onto carts for the construction sites of the Vatican. The work proceeded systematically, according to issued licenses, with documented volumes. There was another type of recycling, one that is discussed less often. Marble that couldn't be used in blocks, broken, non-standard, was loaded onto barges and taken to the lime kilns on the banks of the Tiber. There it was burned and turned into building lime. The forums of Rome were literally dissolved into the walls of new buildings, physically, chemically, in the literal sense of the word. Pope Pius II issued a bull in 1462 prohibiting the further export of stone from ancient monuments. It would seem to be a protective measure. However, the same bull included an exception. Projects already commenced under issued licenses could continue until completion. The protection was crafted in a way that would not halt any ongoing contracts. A ban with a hole the size of the Colosseum. But even that is not the main point. What is telling is this. Contemporaries wrote quite openly about what was happening to the monuments of Rome. The architect Antonio da Sangallo explicitly stated in his notes that the Colosseum was being dismantled with the highest permission. Papal contractors did not hide. The volumes were not concealed. It was a public, documented operation, officially referred to as the restoration of antique heritage. This is an important detail, not because it compromises specific individuals, but because it describes a method. The Renaissance did not begin with a blank slate. It started with foreign material, foreign constructions, which were rearranged, renamed, and integrated into new narratives. And the rhetoric of the spirit of antiquity served as a wrapper for a process that was organized quite differently. And if they worked with stones like that, the obvious question arises: how did they work with knowledge? Look, the year 1420. The Florence Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore has stood with an unfinished dome for 140 years. The diameter of the span is 45.5 meters. According to the calculations of that time, It is impossible to close such a span without massive wooden centering scaffolds. There aren't enough scaffolds, neither trees, nor money, nor technology. The task was so complex that in 1418, the City Council of Florence announced an open competition. People came from all over Europe. No one could propose a workable solution. Some suggested filling it with soil containing coins and hiring the townspeople to remove it themselves for the coins. This was the level of understanding of the task. And then Filippo Brunelleschi appears, a jeweler, a man who lost the competition for the bronze doors of the baptistry. He goes to Rome, studies the Pantheon for several years, and returns with a ready solution. No scaffolding, a double brick shell, a herringbone pattern that holds itself together during the construction process. After 16 years, the dome stands. And to this day, it remains the largest brick dome in the world. The official version says he uncovered the secret of the Romans. Only one problem. The Pantheon is a monolithic concrete dome. It has neither a double shell nor brickwork in a herringbone pattern. These are fundamentally different technologies. The concrete is poured and hardens as a single body. Brickwork is a collection of individual elements that need to be held in place during construction until the mortar sets. The Pantheon offers no answers to this. Studying the Pantheon, one cannot understand how to lay bricks using a self-supporting method at a height of 50 meters, simply because it doesn't exist in the Pantheon. Open any catalog of medieval European architecture. Find at least one small experimental dome with herringbone masonry built in Tuscany before the year 1420. A trial, a rough draft, anything. He is not here. Usually, when a fundamentally new engineering technology emerges, it goes through a testing period. First, small objects, then medium ones, and finally, large ones. This is the logic of any technical development. In this case, that period does not exist. The technology appears all at once in the form of the largest dome in Europe, without a childhood. That's not how it works. And now, a different route. Not Rome. Iran. The mausoleum of Oljetu in Sultania was built around the year 1310, more than 100 years before Brunelleschi's dome. Its dome is a double shell. Its masonry employs the herringbone technique. It is a self-supporting structure that holds itself up during the construction process without external supports. Exactly the same. The mausoleum in Sultania is not the only example. In Iran and the territories of the Ilkhanate by the 14th century, there was a whole tradition of such domes, of various scales with different variations, but with one principle. This tradition did not exist at all in Europe. This is not a random similarity between two independent solutions. In construction, there are no coincidental alignments of systemic engineering methods. Either one arises from the other, or both stem from a third common source. At first glance, it seems like merely parallel development. Different civilizations offer different answers to the same challenges. But then answer me this. Why is there not a single intermediate dome using this technique in Europe between the Persian buildings of the 14th century and Florence of the 15th? The logic of technological development is structured in such a way. First, a principle appears. Then it is realized in small forms, then in medium, and finally in large ones. This applies to any engineering technology, from bricklaying to engines. If a principle is absent throughout Europe until the year 1420, and then suddenly it appears in the largest dome on the continent, it means that the principle arrived fully formed. from the outside. The Florentine guilds, primarily wool traders, arte della lana, were deeply integrated into trade networks with the East. Fabrics, spices, and dyes flowed through these networks. Why not technologies? Here is a specific route that is almost never spoken aloud. In the early 15th century, delegations arrived in Florence for church councils, including those from Constantinople and the Middle East. Among the visitors were architects, mechanics, and mathematicians. Florence during this period was a crossroads, not an isolated laboratory of a single genius. Jacopo Berengario da Carpi, an experienced builder, left notes where he mentions Eastern masters who advised Florentine constructions at the beginning of the century. These notes are quoted very rarely. The version of the lonely jeweler who guessed the secret of the Pantheon is much more convenient. And here's what is important. Brunelleschi destroyed his drawings. He gave instructions to the masters in small portions, so that none of them saw the complete picture. Officially, this is explained by a fear of theft of the invention. But if it was a personal discovery, what exactly was he hiding? From whom? If knowledge came from outside, then everything falls into place. He wasn't hiding an invention, he was hiding the source. The first detailed biography of Brunelleschi was compiled by Antonio Manetti, 40 years after the completion of the dome. Vasari later repeated this account a century later. Neither of them was an eyewitness. Both crafted an image. Both worked during a time when the narrative of the Florentine genius had already become an established cultural product that was advantageous to uphold. A biography composed 40 years later, based on stories, is a very specific type of source. Between studying the Pantheon and the finished dome lies a chasm that biographers bridge with the word genius. In engineering, such chasms do not exist. There is a chain of solutions. And if this chain is not visible in Tuscany, it is likely visible somewhere else. The same mechanism worked with the laying technology. Take what is ready, adapt it, conceal the information, and put your name on it. Stones are from foreign buildings. Technology is from foreign constructions. Now, knowledge. Imagine a situation where you are studying mathematics from a textbook that contains 7 errors in the multiplication table. Everyone around you has been using the same book for 1,500 years. The mistakes are being passed down from generation to generation because no one checks against the original. No one verifies. This is akin to Galen in European medicine of the 15th century. Galen lived in the 2nd century. His anatomical descriptions were primarily based on dissections of animals, pigs and monkeys. Transposing these observations to humans resulted in significant errors, serious, structural. However, Galen's authority was so great that when instructors dissected bodies in public demonstrations and observed discrepancies with the texts, they explained this by saying that the body had changed over the millennia. It was not Galen who was mistaken. The body had changed. That was the system. 1538. The young Flemish anatomist Andreas Vesalius publishes Tabulae Sex, 6 anatomical tables. The standard level, Galen's diagrams with typical mistakes that have been passed down through European treatises for 14 centuries. Nothing fundamentally new. 1543 year. The same Vesalius publishes De Humani Corporis Fabrica, a complete atlas of the human body. Hyper-realistic illustrations of muscles, vessels, nerves, internal organs. A level of precision that will not be surpassed for another 200 years. There are 5 years between these two publications. Remember this number, 5 years. Behind Galen's mistakes lies 1,500 years of European medicine. Generation after generation, the same diagrams were copied. And suddenly, one man, in just 5 years, not only corrects these errors, but also creates an atlas that settles the topic for 2 centuries to come. All of this is achieved solely through personal autopsies of corpses. Is it possible? Let's examine this through logistics. To create an atlas of such a level solely through dissections, an enormous amount of fresh material would be required. In Padua of the mid-16th century, a city with strict religious restrictions, it was physically impossible to obtain so many bodies within 5 years. This is a bottleneck that official history tends to overlook. One body allowed for the study of a limited set of structures. The rest were destroyed before their turn came. To sketch all the systems with the level of detail present in De Fabrica, hundreds were needed. No documents regarding the legitimate supply of material on such a scale have survived in Padua, because they did not exist. There is one more technical point. Drawing anatomical illustrations is a separate discipline that requires years of training. It was not part of medical education in the 16th century. To reach the level of De Fabrica in just 5 years, one either had to already be able to draw at the level of Titian's workshop, or, as is obvious, hire that very workshop. Now another route. Mansur ibn Ilyas, a Persian physician, created an anatomical atlas in 1390. This was 150 years before Vesalius. Full-page diagrams of the skeleton, muscular systems, and vessels. The overall compositional logic of these diagrams, the arrangement of figures, the system of turns, the presentation of systems separately, strikingly resembles the structure of Vesalius's atlas. Ibn al-Nafis described the small circle of circulation in the 13th century. This is one of the key discoveries of the epoch, that blood passes through the lungs before entering the large circulation. European medicine discovered this in the 16th century. Ibn al-Nafis had documented it 3 centuries earlier. Vesalius worked as an editor of the Latin translations of Al-Razi, an Arab encyclopedist whose medical treatises covered anatomy, physiology, and clinical descriptions, before publishing his atlas. This is not speculation. It is a documented fact in his biography that is typically mentioned in a footnote, but not explored in detail. It's worth pausing on this a bit longer. Al-Razi is not a peripheral author. He is a medical encyclopedia in 20 volumes, which was known in medieval Europe as continence and used as a primary reference. Vesalius did not simply know about Arabic medicine. He professionally worked with its texts, translated, edited, and prepared them for publication. A year of editing Al-Razi, a year, and De Fabrica. Another point that is often overlooked. Before Vesalius, there was Jacopo Berengario da Carpi, a Bolognese anatomist who in 1521 had already published detailed illustrations from nature and directly challenged Galen's errors. This was 22 years before De Fabrica. Berengario took the first step. Vesalius occupied all the space. In the history of medicine, the first today is a rare footnote. The second is a revolutionary who changed science. The illustrations in De Fabrica were not done by Vesalius. They were created by Titian's workshop, most likely the Flemish master Jan Stefan van Kalkar. De Fabrica was from the very beginning a commercial publishing project with strong visual packaging, not a personal diary of a scholar uncovering the unknown. It was a project aimed at presenting accumulated knowledge under one name with a single publication date. Officially, it's explained this way. Thesalius was simply the first to dare to take the scalpel in his own hands, instead of lecturing over dissections. Okay. But then, why do his discoveries structurally coincide with what Arab physicians recorded 200 and 300 years before him? Why is the contribution of these doctors intentionally minimized in textbooks? The dome is from Persian experience. Anatomy is from Arab treatises. And in both cases, there is one common feature. At some point, the information about the source is concealed. Intentionally. Irrevocably. It is here that the third part of this story begins, about a man who posed the question differently. Because while we analyze individual borrowings, one can still think about random coincidences. But in the mid-16th century, there was a person in Rome who raised a completely different question. Not where to find knowledge, but where to find a source that can be cited. This is a fundamental difference. Knowledge is what you know. A source is what confirms that you have always known it. The difference between them is the difference between a person who has found something valuable and a person who can prove that it belonged to them from the very beginning. Piero Ligorio was an architect, antiquarian, and the creator of the Villa d'Este in Tivoli. He was one of the most educated people of his time. According to 19th century historians, he was the greatest forger in the history of the study of antiquity. His specialization is Latin inscriptions, epigraphy, stones with engraved texts that confirm names, titles, events, lineages. The primary source for historians studying Rome. A stone with an inscription carried more weight in court than any written testimony. A stone could not be rewritten. It could not be declared a forgery based solely on someone's words. Ligorio created thousands of such inscriptions. Fake ones. Not dozens, not hundreds, thousands. He invented the names of state officials. He fabricated positions. He created entire lineages of noble families, validated by found stones. His forgeries were so technically perfected that they were included in the largest collections of the era as originals. Cardinal Farnese, one of the wealthiest men in Rome, kept them in his collection among genuine ancient artifacts. In the 19th century, German historian Theodor Mommsen embarked on the creation of the Corpus Inscriptionum Latinarum, a comprehensive, systematic collection of Latin inscriptions. This was a large-scale scientific project that took decades to complete. When the work was finished, it became clear that a special section needed to be designated within the collection. It was named Falsi Ligoriani, the forgeries of Ligorio. Out of 180,000 inscriptions in the collection, there were hundreds bearing this label. Mommsen was shaken, not by isolated cases, but by the scale. He wrote to his colleagues that when you start to understand how many inscriptions were fabricated, you begin to question, what part of what seemed reliable actually passed through the hands of Ligorio or those like him? This question remains unanswered. Hundreds of inscriptions that historiography relied on were found to have been created by one person in the 16th century. The most obvious explanation is that he was an enthusiastic erudite who filled in the gaps where real sources were lacking. A noble delusion. But then why did his patrons, the very noble families, so willingly pay for the found inscriptions that confirmed their antiquity and their rights? Ligorio erased the boundary that separates the true antique from the made in the style of antiquity. His work was not a scholar's hobby. It was a service. You came with a request. You left with a stone confirmation. The genealogy was ready. The source was documented. But Ligorio worked not only with inscriptions. He created maps of Rome that depicted the original ancient city in the desired configuration. He wrote scholarly comments on findings, referring to sources whose existence he himself ensured. A closed loop of references, each confirming the other, and all of them ultimately traced back to a single author. It is important to understand that this was not an isolated case of a quirky forger. Ligorio was working on commission. His clients included cardinals, dukes, and papal officials. Each of them needed antique legitimization of their power, their lands, their claims. An inscription on stone carried more weight than any oral testimony. A documentary primary source settled any dispute. A 19th century historian who worked with the archives of Rome wrote in his notes, "There is a sense that in the 16th century there was a distinct profession, a producer of the past." He was referring to Ligorio. But the question is broader. If such a person could work openly for decades for the highest clients, it means there was a market. It means there was demand. It means this was not an anomaly. It was part of the system. Consider the scale of this. Ligorio created counterfeit inscriptions from around 1545 to 1583. That's almost 40 years of active work. During that time, he managed to fill the largest collections in Italy with his material. Some of this material is still kept in museums. Some was used as a foundation for subsequent historical research that then became sources for further studies. The error embedded in the foundation is reproduced repeatedly, each time sinking deeper into the layers of academic legitimacy. It is necessary to understand how this worked technically. Ligorio didn't just invent inscriptions out of thin air. He studied genuine texts and created forgeries that seamlessly fit into the existing context. He used real names of actual positions, authentic abbreviations, and true paleography. The difference between his work and the original was only apparent to a specialist who had seen the entire corpus as a whole. Such a specialist did not exist until Mommsen. There is another layer that is rarely talked about. Ligorio worked as a curator of collections for several major patrons in succession: Cardinal Ferrara, Pope Pius IV, the d'Este family. Each time, he gained access to authentic ancient artifacts. Each time, his finds appeared alongside them. Authentic and counterfeit items were stored in the same room, described in the same catalogs, and cited in the same treatises. The boundary was physically erased. Look at how this mechanism worked as a whole. The first step: you take someone else's physical material. Columns from dismantled therms go into the new palace. The cost is minus 80%. You call it respect for antiquity. You gain a reputation as a patron. The second step: you take someone else's engineering or intellectual knowledge. The Persian method of masonry, under the dome of a cathedral. Arab anatomical diagrams, into a revolutionary European atlas. You close the source. You destroy the drawings. You hire a biographer 40 years later. You place your name in history. The third step: when sources are lacking, they are fabricated. Inscriptions, genealogies, documents. The past is rewritten to meet the current demand. The cardinal needs an ancient genealogy. There is Ligorio. The pope needs proof of land ownership. There is the corresponding inscription. The necessary inscription appears. 3 steps. A simple scheme that has worked for decades. At each level, there were professionals of their own kind. Contractors with papal licenses for quarrying stone. Translators of Arabic and Persian treatises whose names never made it to the title page. Illustrators who crafted visual packaging for others' discoveries. And people like Ligorio who produced primary sources on demand. It was an industry with a division of labor. No sign on the door, but with a regular clientele and clear prices. And here arises a question that is uncomfortable to ask, but impossible not to ask. If hundreds of inscriptions from our collection of ancient sources were created by a single forger from the 16th century, how many exactly? How much of what we call knowledge about antiquity was actually produced by those who had a vested interest in a particular depiction of the past? We don't know. And that's the main problem. Because the question concerns not only Ligorio and not just the inscriptions. Behind each of the 3 steps in this scheme lies the same operation. Information about the origin is concealed at the moment when it could explain everything. Brunelleschi destroys the drawings precisely when the dome is already in place. Vesalius makes no mention of the Arab predecessors whose treatises he edited a year earlier. Ligorio operates under the patronage of popes and cardinals, people who have all the tools to verify, but no motivation to do so. This is a persistent pattern. It indicates not just the random forgetfulness of a few individuals, but that the closing of the trail was part of the very logic of the process itself. 1,500 years of Galen's errors have been corrected in 5 years. A dome, which all of Europe could not construct, emerges without a single intermediate prototype. Inscriptions that, by the standards of historians, are 14 centuries old, turn out to have been made in the 16th century. Sources that are supposed to confirm the past were produced to support a desired conclusion about that past. These are not coincidences. This is a handwriting, the same one, traceable. And the most interesting thing about this handwriting is not even that it existed, but how well it worked. So well that we still call it the Renaissance. We teach it in universities as the history of human genius. We guide people through museums and showcase it as proof that the mind can conquer darkness solely through the power of observation. But the darkness here is not in the Middle Ages. The darkness lies in what we take to be the source of light.